let's make a start. Preparing for the operational case study. So the plan is to look first of all at the background to the operational case study exam. So we'll take a look at the format of the exam itself. We'll then be looking at your role as a finance officer. So you are pretty low down the hierarchy, and there are certain expectations that CIMA has in terms of how you conduct yourself on the day of the exam. And if you understand your role well, you'll know how to respond accordingly to the different questions that you get on the day of the exam. So it's important that you have the right mindset. CIMA talks a lot about that in the recent brochures that they've been publishing about the mindset of the exam candidate being crucial. Next up then, we have using the pre-scene. There's no mystery as to how best to use the pre-scene. We generally like to keep things as simple as possible at VIVA, but no simpler. So I'll highlight an approach to untangling the elements of the pre-scene in that particular section that I think will stand you in good stead. Then we'll talk about applying theory, because this is not a theory exam. This is all about taking what you know and applying it to the specifics of the case. So very practical exam. It's meant to reflect the world of real work. So that's the point of this exam. It's a simulation. It's meant to be realistic. Then we'll talk about tying all of those elements up, the theory, the pre-scene information, any industry information, etc., and trying to summarize all of that for yourself in a condensed format so that it's easier to remember when you go into the exam. And then finally, we'll talk about the importance of mock exam practice. It's where a lot of candidates fall down. They do all of the other preparation, but they neglect doing as many mock exams as they can, and that is often what trips candidates up. Okay then, first of all, let's talk about the format of the exam. The background to the operational case study, this is a graphic that you might be familiar with. Some of you would have come through the certificate level of the CIMA qualification. So they would be the fundamentals of management accounting, financial accounting, etc. And many of you would actually have received an exemption from actually sitting those exams. So the operational level is your first contact with CIMA. If the operational level is your first contact with CIMA, the first exams you might have done would be E1, P1 and F1. And assuming you've passed those, then you would have the right to take the operational case study exam, which is the focus of this particular presentation. So E1, P1 and F1 are objective tests, and they're a different beast. So for those of you who came through those exams, you'll know the format. For those of you still having to sit them, they are multiple choice type exams, computer based, although the case study is also computer based. However, the objective tests are actually not human marked as the case study exam is. Instead, you get a pass-fail provisional result straight away having sat the objective exam. That's not the case with the operational case study exam. You have to wait 5 to 6 weeks before you get your result, because there's actually someone going through your script and correcting it. So there's a real human being doing that. So different types of exam. The objective test is a pure theoretical test, whereas the case study is much more about application and business acumen. So the background then to the operational case study tells us that the operational case study exam is meant to be modern. It's meant to be relevant to your own experience in the workplace. So therefore, it's meant to be a realistic representation of the kinds of problems you could encounter in your real life work as a finance officer, for example. And Therefore, it's a simulation. It's meant to closely mimic your experience as a finance officer in a company such as the one you'll be presented with in the case study. The structure then of the case study exam involves you receiving a pre-seen document. It typically runs from about 25 pages on, 25 to 27 or 8 pages usually. It's a dossier of information on a fictional business, but the business is very much modeled on real life companies in real world industries. So you're meant to work through this document in detail ahead of the exam. So you've got 6 or 7 weeks typically to prepare the document, to understand your company, to understand the context within which your company is operating. And you take all of that, you go into the exam, and you draw on that information on the day of the exam to make sensible recommendations to the questions that are being put to you by your manager, senior managers, etc. in the exam. So in any one exam sitting, CIMA will create 5 exam variants. So they'll create 5 versions of the operational case study. And the format has changed a little bit with the new syllabus, whereas with the 2015 syllabus, there were 4 exam windows with 4 different operational cases. Now what CIMA has done is they will still have 4 exam windows, one in February, one in May, one in August and one in November, but they're only going to have 2 cases. So one case would serve 2 exam windows. So if you have to repeat the exam because you fail, say in May, and you're going to take the exam again later on in November, for example, and it involves the same case, well, that's convenient because you wouldn't have to start again with a fresh case. You could go back and review the case you've already studied. So within each variant, there are timed sections with tasks for the candidate to complete. So typically you've got 4 sections in the operational case study exam. Once you move on from one section to the next section, you can't go back. So that's another way in which the case study is different to the objective test. So with the objective test, you can actually move between questions back and forth. You can flag questions and go back later if you're stuck with them. That's not the case with the case study. So once you finish with the section and you move on, then you cannot go back. So features of the operational case study exam. First of all, it is a computer-based exam, just like the objective test, but unlike the objective test, it's actually marked by a human being. So this obviously means that, not everyone is going to be the same in how they mark this exam. You would like for that to be the case, but different people are looking for different things in general. So this is a little bit, there's the possibility of human error creeping into it, etc. You don't know. You might get a certain marker that is a little bit harsher than another, but that's outside of your control, so you can't really worry about that. What I will say though is that CIMA does recognize that certain variants or certain versions of their exams are a little bit harder than other versions of the exam. So they take that into account. So if one version is more difficult than another version, they will sort of even that out, and they introduce something called scaled scores, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. So the operational case study exam is 3 hours. And for the operational case study, typically what you have are 4 sections with 45 minutes each. That sounds like loads of time, but always candidates find that it's a very time-pressured exam. And time management is crucial in passing this exam. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. At the start of the exam, before you actually start, you've got a 15-minute tutorial talking you through different exam windows, etc., the different exhibits you'll get in different sections, how to move back, how to move forward from different sections, etc. But we'll I'll walk you through some of the different elements you'll come across in the exam so that you're not completely surprised on the day of the exam itself. So the exam result consists of, you'll get this exam result 5 to 6 weeks after you sit your paper, a pass-fail grade, a scaled score running from 0 to 150, which is the maximum. A pass score is 80 or above, and feedback on performance for each core activity. Now, we'll talk about the core activities in a minute because they're a new part of the 2019 CIMA syllabus. They weren't present in the old case. So there are 6 core activities that CIMA likes to test for the operational case study exam. So that scaled score running from 0 to 150, you need to ensure that you secure a mark of at least 80 to pass. And as I said before, the CIMA takes into account the fact that certain versions or certain variants of their exam are a little bit trickier than other variants. So for the trickier variants, they will be more lenient on the exam candidates, and they take that into account. So you might be on the border line, so they'll mark it first and you'll just have failed, for example, and they'll realize that, you know, this particular version that they have is a little bit trickier because they're seeing more fails, and they might take some of those borderline candidates and just nudge them over the pass mark, taking into account how difficult that particular version was. So just something to bear in mind. So moving on then to these core activities, a new part of the 2019 CIMA syllabus, as I said. So first of all, these are job tasks that you, as a finance officer, are expected to be able to do well. So the first particular activity that CIMA wants to see you are able to do well is preparation of costing information for different purposes to meet the needs of management. Okay, so very much drawing on P1 syllabus topics, but also touching on E1, surprisingly enough. It doesn't look like that with this statement, but I'll tell you why in a minute. So that would typically account for 12 to 18% of the marks that CIMA will allocate in the operational case study exam. The second big area that CIMA wants to see students be able to address is the preparation of budget information and assessment of budgets for planning and control purposes. So that would draw on variance analysis, for example, and very much again a core P1 management accounting area. The third area is more related to F1, but also draws on E1 as well, analysing performance using financial and non-financial information. 70 to 25% of the total marks will fall under this particular area in any one exam. The fourth big area is the application of relevant financial reporting standards. So that's F1, financial accounting, and corporate governance, ethical and tax principles. So corporate governance and ethics very much from E1, tax principles again from F1. And those areas would account for 12 to 18%. So you can see here that what started out as perhaps an expectation that CIMA was making things much easier for students with these 6 core areas, you think, well, you know, they're drastically reducing the number of potential areas they can test, because in the old case studies under the 2015 syllabus, they could test absolutely anything, and they did. You think, okay, 6 core activities, I can really narrow down and focus on what's going to come up. But these are actually quite broad. They're not really helping you. You still essentially have to cover almost all areas of E1, F1 and P1 ahead of the exam. The next area, the fifth area, is preparing information to support short-term decision making. So drawing on P1 and F1 syllabus topics, that accounts for 17 to 25% of the marks that are allocated for the operational case study. And the last area, The last core activity is preparing information to manage working capital. So very linked to F1 again, 7 to 13%. So in particular, you should be paying a lot of attention to the areas that are flagged up as representing most of the marks. So they would be areas B, C, and E. Unfortunately, you cannot neglect the other three areas because they will account for some percentage of the marks. But if you're wanting to approach this in terms of the order you go at the different theoretical topics, it would be worth emphasizing first B, C, and E, and then following up with the other three areas. So that's your technical know-how essentially being covered. So the operational case study continues to be, has a lot to do with being technically very competent. And as you move up through the levels with CIMA, technical skills become less important. When you get to the management and strategic case study levels, what you find is you're drawing more on softer skills, but that's not so much the case with the operational level. It's very much about ensuring you have solid technical know-how in E1, P1 and F1. So the reason that I say that these core activities are a little bit misleading, that you have the expectation that CIMA is really narrowing down what you need to focus on. It's not really, because when you actually dig into the information behind each of these 6 core activities, CIMA includes very broad guidelines in terms of what they would be assessing. So this particular document that I'm highlighting, I'm just highlighting the first 2 core activities that we talked about, but it's the same for the other 4, very, very broad. This particular snippet comes from one of CIMA's documents that they put together for the 2019 syllabus on how to approach the operational level. They talk specifically about the operational case study. And what I'll do after this webinar is I'll send this to you in email format so that you can look through it in your own time. But this will give you an idea as to how broad these core activity areas actually are, because you look at the first one there. A, preparing costing information for different purposes to meet the needs of management. So that very much looks like a P1 only set of topics that you would have to revise. But once you start digging into it, you see that it touches on, the digital technologies being covered, especially in E1. With the new CIMA syllabus, CIMA has really overhauled the enterprise subjects. So they are E1, E2 and E3 as you move up through the levels. At the operation level in particular, the subject that is most changed is E1. And P1 and F1 are very similar to what they were before. They took a couple of topics out of F1, but really that was all they did with the F1 and P1. They're largely unchanged. But where the big changes took place were with E1, which focuses greatly now on digital technologies and understanding them. So you can see straight away that CIMA is flagging up potential assessment areas relating to technologies to gather data, appropriate formats and media for presenting data to senior management, digital cost objects, which is covered in P1, gathering digital and other sources relating to new technologies for the preparation of budget information, etc. So you start to see straight away that these core activities are actually quite broad. So unfortunately, it's much like the old syllabus. The new syllabus requires you to cover a broad spectrum of objective test theories ahead of your exam. Okay, so that's a little bit the background of the exam and the format of the exam we're going to take a look at now. So on the day of the exam, these are the kinds of screens you'll be presented with. So I want them to be less of a surprise for you when you go into the exam. So first of all, you'll notice that typically you'll have 4 sections. This is I don't pay too much mind to the fact that this is management case study because it's the exact same for the operational case study. 4 sections typically. Each section will be 45 minutes long. That seems like a lot, but you'll find when you get into it that the time flies. And once you go into a section, typically you'll be presented with this kind of trigger. So the scene will be set. There will be a scenario where you'll get some kind of an email, typically from your manager, for example, and a task will be set. It's important to point out that you can access the pre-scene document at any point throughout the exam. So CIMA makes that available to you. It's a clean copy, so it's not like you're bringing in your own document with your annotations and highlighting, etc. No, it's a clean copy. But ideally what you want to be doing is not referring to that pre-scene. You want to know the pre-scene very well ahead of the exam so that you're not wasting time jumping back and forth between the pre-scene document and the questions you've been set. But it's important to flag that it is available if you do get stuck with a name or a figure or something like that. You also have a countdown timer up in the top right of the exam. So you don't want to obsess over that because you'll get quite nervous if you're just looking at the timer all the time. But you want to keep an eye on it. Every couple of minutes you want to be taking a look up to ensure that you're working pretty swiftly through the scenario. So you'll be set tasks. You'll also get reference materials very typically in each section. So they would be tables of figures. You might have financial statement extracts from your own company, budget figures, variance analysis, etc. So a lot of students worry that they're going to have to do very intricate calculations on the day of the exam, like they do in the objective test exams. That's not the case. Typically what you'll be asked to do is to look over a table of figures, financial statements, etc. And you'll be expected to make sense of those figures. And often what you might have is a non-financial expert that works at your company coming to you with the table of figures, and they'll have made some error in their calculations, or they'll make some faulty assumption, and you'll be expected to spot the error. And it might well be that there's no mention of an error. So that's where your technical knowledge will come to bear. Okay, so it's less about doing calculations and it's more about working through calculations and flagging up any faulty assumptions, flagging up any erroneous figures. So then you'll be presented with what your manager or director or senior manager is actually looking for. And often you can skip down to the end of a particular scenario and find in bullet point format in the operational case study, that's where a lot of the questions are actually coming. So often it's a good idea when you go into a particular section to straight away look out for any bullet points or numbered items. Typically at the end of an email you'll be asked what to do, and the rest of the information is sort of just setting the scene. So it's a good idea to quickly try to flag those questions as early as possible so you know what you're actually being asked for. So these are examples of the kinds of reference materials that you'll be presented with. So here we have a comparison, it seems, between three companies, financial statements, with some ratios thrown in as well. So they're the kind of things that you could be presented with. So you're not the one actually calculating these figures. Someone's already done it for you, but you're expected to compare these figures in a sensible way. You'll also have an answer screen, so you'll be typing directly into the answer screen. It's like a word processing document, and you should get used to practicing as many mock exams as you can. I'll talk more about the importance of that towards the end of this particular presentation. Okay, so that's the context, that's the format of the exam. Let's talk about your role. So you've got to play the part, you've got to get your mindset right. You are a finance officer, and as you prepare in the weeks before the exam, that's the way you've got to be thinking. How would a finance officer at this particular company respond on the day of the exam? As a finance officer, you're obviously quite low down the hierarchy. If you take a look at the picture on the left, you'll see that the finance officers will be located on the bottom rung there. So you're likely to be dealing with people in the intermediary rung predominantly. So they would be managers, for example, maybe some senior managers. You're not likely to be dealing too often with the senior managers and the directors and people running, making the strategic decisions for the business. So the CEO, the CFO, etc. But you will be dealing with other finance officers, for example. You'll be dealing with managers, etc. So you're assisting decision makers. You're not the one actually taking the decisions. You're not the one setting out the strategy of the business. That's something you would do at the strategic case study. But you are the one who is meant to make sensible recommendations, to untangle data and to present it in a sensible way so that the decision makers of the business can take that information and make the strategic decisions themselves. You need to know how to interpret figures, work through financial statements, watch out for errors, etc., as I said before, and consider carefully who you are speaking to. I say that because if you're speaking with a fellow finance member, same department, for example, you can assume that they understand what you mean when you talk about budgeting and variance analysis, when you talk about different financial accounting standards. But if you're dealing with someone from HR or marketing, you cannot make that assumption. So if you're dealing with someone like that, you need to spend a little bit of time unpacking the terminology. So if they come to you with a doubt about a financial statement comparison between your company and another company, first of all, you should be alert to any false assumptions they might be making because they're not finance experts. So watch out for that. But secondly, be aware that because they're not financial experts, that you might need to spend a little bit more time unpacking technical terms. Now, you do not need to spend a lot of time. 2 to 3 lines unpacking a technical term would be sufficient. Secondly, as a finance officer, your focus is going to be on the short term. So typically 1 to 3 months, maybe 6 months, maximum 12 months. So you're focused very much on the running of the business, the day-to-day operational issues, and that will tend to draw on your technical expertise. So some of those things that we've mentioned before, financial statements and understanding financial accounting standards, understanding the recommendations you would make, for short-term financing, understanding budgets and variance analysis over a short-term time horizon, etc. So technical know-how is important. And it's important not only that you make sensible business recommendations and you draw on your technical know-how, but that you give ethical advice. Draw on the CIMA Code of Ethics. CIMA is really, really looking to educate future finance professionals that are not just effective in terms of their business know-how and their financial accounting and management accounting know-how. They want to form the next generation of leaders that are expected to be ethical professionals. So watch out for anyone who comes to you on the day of the exam. It could be quite typically we find in the operational case study, for example, you might work for quite a small company. It could be a family business. Often you would have a very dominant founder and CEO who has most of the shares in the company, for example. It might be a private company rather than a publicly listed company. And that person might come to you and put pressure on you to present figures in an overly optimistic light. So that's an example of where you'd be expected to push back. You're expected to do the right thing. You're not expected to just buckle under that pressure and say, okay, the boss is putting pressure on me. I need to just go along with him or her because he or she is so influential. No, you're expected to push back and draw on the CIMA Code of Ethics. CIMA really likes to see that being mentioned as a supporting framework for your answers if you're presented with an ethical issue. So I want to again flag up some of the things that CIMA has been saying itself in its literature. Again, this is coming from the same document I mentioned before. It's a blueprint that CIMA put together on how to approach the operational level. And I'll send it to you, as I say, after this particular session. So you're an entry-level professional. As I said, budgeting is going to be very, very important. It's all about the short term. So thinking about opportunities and threats. And we'll refer to the SWOT analysis later on. There's a great tool for summing up some of the key issues affecting your business ahead of the exam. So you'll be expected to draw on data that the company has stored away in its information system. So digital technologies are going to be very, very important in the new syllabus. That's predominantly E1. Working with short-term financing, that's F1. Technologies that are available for the collection, cleansing and analysis of data, E1. Dealing with colleagues, as I said before, not just from finance, but from other functional areas as well, taking their needs into account and adapting the message that you communicate to them, taking into account their lack of technical finance and management accounting know-how. So obviously financial reporting is important, understanding regulations as they relate to big business taxation, so that's F1, and offering insights that influence the decisions being taken by the people higher up the organization. And then drawing on ethics, finally, thinking about how to be a good professional, not just in terms of how effective you are as a finance professional, making solid recommendations that impact positively on the bottom line of the business, but making the right recommendations in terms of ethics. So the mindset is crucial. And CIMA mentions this in their literature repeatedly. So going beyond pure technical questions, looking to influence others, so communicating well, taking into account who am I actually dealing with, who's on the other side of this interaction. Understanding the business context, so not just knowing what your business is about, but understanding the wider context. And I mean by that, the industry that you operate in, the environment you operate in, so considering stakeholders of multiple stakeholders, so the community in which you're operating in, thinking about government and regulations that come to bear, thinking about your competitors. That makes you a more rounded finance professional. So take all of those into account when you're making your recommendations. Being digitally savvy, so understanding the key topics that come up in E1, that's where the big changes have come with the 2019 syllabus. So make sure you run over those technical areas in E1. As I said, P1 and F1 has not changed hugely. E1 is where most of the changes have come. Ethical awareness is crucial. I mentioned the CIMA Code of Ethics. So they're the big areas that you need to consider when you're thinking about your role. Okay, next up we have using the pre-scene. First of all, it's worth reflecting on the purpose of the pre-scene document. You get this document 6 or 7 weeks before the exam. So you want to make good use of it. There's a reason that CIMA gives you this document 6 or 7 weeks before the exam. Those students who do not make use of the document tend to fail. And the ones who prepare it well understand the information and the implications of what's included in the pre-scene. So not just taking what's in the pre-scene, but going beyond that, imagining scenarios, imagining exam questions, applying what you know theoretically to the information in the pre-scene. They're the candidates who do well. So this is a dossier of realistic business information. 25 to 30 pages typically. And it allows you to understand not just your business. It's a fictional business, but it's, as I said, based on a real-life company or based on a mix of real-life companies quite often. But also your own role in the business. Thinking about that, getting the mindset right. The context, the industry within which you work. But going beyond that, thinking of the stakeholders, your competitors, the wider community in which you're operating. There could be, a scenario in which your business is creating negative externalities for the wider community. So it might be that your business is making something that is damaging the environment. And of course, that is to the fore of everyone's minds nowadays. So you would be expected to keep that in mind. You'd be expected to make recommendations that reduced those negative externalities and showed that the company was a good corporate citizen. And thinking through lots of the issues facing the business. So a typical pre-scene would include financial statements. So that's very much about focusing on the bottom line, the profitability of the company. That's pure financial accounting, and that's all about business acumen. That's the traditional role of a finance professional. Articles, and they will tend to go beyond just the numbers. So they will often flag up, press articles will often flag up potential threats and potential opportunities to your business. And often they will kind of foreshadow potential exam issues. So it's worth paying a lot of attention to what comes up in the articles included in the pre-scene. Costing and budgeting information. So that's P1. So thinking about, the information included there. Often you'll have the budget for the next year or so. You'd compare that to the prior financial statements to see how the company is expected to evolve. Are they becoming more profitable? Are they expected to grow their revenue, etc.? And often then in the exam day, you might be presented with going beyond just the budget numbers. You'd be asked to compare the budget information that you're presented with in the pre-scene with actuals. And then you'd be expected to flag up the reason for positive and negative variances. Competitive information is often also included. Sometimes you'll have competitive financial statements indeed included, and you'll be expected to think through those issues as well. So that's the purpose of the pre-scene document. So what do you actually do with this? Well, there's no need to complicate things. The approach is pretty simple, but not easy. Okay, so it's one thing to say all of this. It's another to have the discipline to work through all of these things. So understanding the company, first of all, the key affairs of the business, the products that the company makes, the services that they offer currently, and going beyond that and thinking through what they could potentially offer. So their current product portfolio might see the company being squeezed by competitors, their profitability might have turned down, and with that kind of scenario, you might be expected to generate ideas on new product categories that the company could go into, or new markets, for example, that they could go into. Financial analysis as well is very, very crucial. Comparing, statements from a previous year to the current year, seeing how they change, what are the trends, how do the ratios look, thinking how the competitors' financial statements look in comparison to yours. So there are some crucial aspects of understanding your own company. A little bit of industry research is very important as well. So some people say that industry research is not important. Typically, you'll have industry information included in the pre-scene document. Some people like to stop at that, not go beyond that. I think it's very important to do a little bit of research outside of the little bit of industry information in the pre-scene document. So you don't need to go down the rabbit hole. You just need to do a little bit of reading. Read about a few real-world competitors. Think through some of the trends affecting the industry. That is a really, really good way to flag up some great ideas that you can have ahead of the exam to flag up potential exam issues. So often CIMA will be drawing on real-world occurrences that they can then include in their exam. So you can steal a march on the examiner by flagging some of those up. So look at newspapers, current affairs, industry articles, and they're all great ways to get good ideas about how to better understand the context in which your industry is actually operating. The suggested approach I would have with the pre-scene document is, first of all, to skim through it. You can do that once or twice. So quickly read through it the first time, then maybe read through it again. You're just trying to understand from a high level more or less what this is about. With a second or third reading, you would go through it in more detail. So you're highlighting key terms only. You don't want to go crazy with the highlighter. That's a common mistake that students make, because if you're highlighting everything, you may as well be highlighting nothing. What you want to do is just to flag up the key terms. The next step is analysing this in detail. So that's where you're making notes. You're thinking about the key theories from E1, F1, P1, thinking about how do these theories actually apply to this information. And then you're thinking of what potential exam issues could actually come up here, and how would I address those exam issues if they came up? What theories would I use? What industry examples could I use there? What examples could I use from my own professional knowledge? Do I know anyone working in this industry? And what do I know about that industry, and how could I use it in the exam? So when you've done all of that, you'll have a lot of information knocking around your head. So it's a good idea to try to summarize everything. You want to condense all of that information. It's going to be quite messy, so you want to condense it into a few key tools, and I'll talk about them in a while. But the SWOT analysis is one such tool. The strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats facing your company. Thinking through maybe 8 to 10 key issues that you've come across in the pre-scene and through your industry research. And that will really help you to home in on some very key areas. And what you'll often find is if you do that, you'll have anticipated a lot of what can come up on the day of the exam. That leads me to my next point, because what a lot of people actually do is they spend too much time worrying and trying to second guess what the examiner is actually going to include in the exam. You do not want to dedicate too much time to guessing exactly the questions that are going to come up. You do want to think about the business and imagine several possible questions that come up, but you want to be pretty loose in your approach here. What you want to do is you want to avoid generating 2 or 3 or 4 questions that you think, these are definitely coming up. That's all I'm going to focus on. That is a bad way to approach this particular exam. What you do want to do is to loosely kind of generate 15 to 20 potential exam scenarios. And you want to kind of sketch how you might approach those. And that's a better approach, because CIMA does and can draw on many, many, many different issues. People who try to prepare 4 or 5 topics that they think will definitely come up, they always get burned, because you might get 1 or 2 of them coming up, but you won't get all of them coming up. The better analysed, the better prepared you are, and the higher your confidence can be. So knowing the pre-scene well, knowing it well enough that you don't need to jump back and forth between the what you're presented with on the day of the exam and the pre-scene document that's included in the exam. If you know the pre-scene well enough to avoid that, you're well set, because you save yourself a lot of time. Next up, we have application of theory. This is crucial. As Einstein said, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they are not. Wise words indeed. This is not a theoretical exam. It's not like the objective tests. This is all about applying what you know. So this is meant to be a real world scenario. So imagine you got an email from your boss tomorrow in your work setting asking you to solve some problem. The last thing you're going to do is write an email back to him or her outlining some model in detail that you have from CIMA, going through the moving parts. No, you're not going to do it. You might mention a theoretical model in passing if it applies, but more often than not, that's not the approach you're going to take. So CIMA wants you to do something similar in this particular exam. This is very much about applying your know-how. And when I say know-how, I do mean the theory that you do for E1, F1 and P1, but that's only part of the story. You're also drawing on your own business acumen, your common sense. You're also drawing on what you know about the industry. You're drawing on what you understand from the pre-scene itself. So, mentioning statistics and figures and facts that were mentioned in the pre-scene, that's great. Using the unseen requirements itself. When I say the unseen requirements, I mean the stuff that's presented to you on the day of the exam. There's so much information that students neglect to use in their answers in the questions themselves. There are tables attached to these questions that you can use, and please make use of those, because often you've got little nuggets included there. CIMA likes to give you hints, and you should make as much use of that information as you can. So again, just drilling this point home, if you're taking a purely theoretical approach, think about your favorite sport. If you're into sports, but the same would apply to music, if you prefer music to sports. But with something like football, we all know who the famous football players are. Your Ronaldos, Messis, Maradona, all these people. It's unlikely that they spent most of their time reading up on, a theoretical approach to football. And there have been lots of books written on that, believe it or not. So they're not going to be reading the theory of football, spending all the time doing that. And, they expect then to go out in the weekend and to get 3 goals. It doesn't work like that. They spend most of their time practicing. They're out on the practice pitch. They're applying what they know. So they're taking the practical approach. It's the same with a tennis player or basketball player. If you're into basketball, then it's not likely you're going to be reading up for ages and ages on how to, shoot 3-pointers or something like that. You're going to go out in the court and practice one 3-point throw after another until you get it right. So it's a similar thing here. It really points to the importance, for example, of mock exam practice. So you spend a little time with the theory, and then you sit down and you're doing as many mock exams as you actually can. So it's about applying theory. And the way that you apply theory is in the mock exams, and then on the day of the exam, your own, the real life exam. So the approach I would suggest is, first of all, you'll know it's not a theory test. It's different to the objective tests. The objective tests are for examining your theoretical know-how, and they're quite dry. The case study is actually a lot more fun because it's so closely modelled on the real world. So the case asks you to apply what you know. And the approach I would suggest is starting your answer with 3 to 4 lines, just explaining what the theory is. So you give a brief snippet of what this theory actually is. But that's all. 3 to 4 lines unpacking what this theory actually is. That would be particularly important if you're dealing with a non-finance person. Then it's all about just getting into the answer and applying it to the case. Ask yourself, how does this theory that I'm using apply to my company? Just keep asking yourself that and keep applying it to your company. There are no marks gained for explaining in intricate detail what this theory is in the abstract. You will not get marks, and the CIMA examiners are always flagging this up as a major area. A student starts explaining what a theory is, and he or she just goes on and on and on and on about the theory, assuming that it's like the objective test exam where that's what you need to do. No, you need to get into how this actually applies to your company. And then once you've offered the 3 or 4 lines on what the theory is, once you show how it applies to your company, you offer supporting evidence. Start drawing on information from the pre-scene that supports your answer. Start drawing on information from the real-life industry that you've studied up on. Start drawing on the pre-scene exhibits and your own professional experience and the information included in the exam on the day. That's how you apply your theory. That's how you apply your know-how to the case. So make sure that your technical knowledge is up to date in those core activities, okay? So certainly it is important to understand the theory and then to apply it. So it's all about tying it up then, because as I said before, you're going to have all of this information from all of these different sources. It's going to be a little bit messy, and what you want to do then is to really focus your energy on condensing all of that information in a summarized format with 2 or 3 key models. The SWOT analysis is an excellent way to do this. So E1 is your friend here. These models that I'm flagging up are all taken from E1. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the strengths and weaknesses relate to the internal workings of your business. Whereas the opportunities and threats very much deal with what is outside your business, so you don't really control it. So with the strengths and weaknesses, you're thinking about the internal strengths and the internal weaknesses of your business. So that's a great way to understand your business. And you should be thinking about also future recommendations you would make in line with your strengths, your internal strengths, and the external opportunities available to the company. So it might be that, that there is a market that is ripe for entry that you have identified, and you would recommend that then on the day of the exam. With the weaknesses, then you want to be avoiding recommendations that play into the weaknesses of the company. Instead, they should be playing into the strengths of your business. And you want to try to mitigate any threats lingering in the external environment. So that's a great model for summing up some of the most important features relating to your particular pre-scene. The PESTEL analysis then is a good one as well to give a high-level overview and a way to condense a lot of the information that you've been working through in the pre-scene in the industry with your own theories, etc. So these are the political, economic, social, technological, environmental and legal considerations you need to bear in mind as being most important in relation to your company. So another great tool for getting at some of the most important aspects impacting on your business. The marketing mix then, what used to be referred to as the 4 Ps of price, product, promotion and place, is now being extended to include 3 more: physical evidence, people and processes. So that's another good way to summarize things in a high level way to really sort of be able to step back from the detail and have a good high level overview. And it's easier then when you use these tools to really sort what is not particularly essential from what is essential. That's what these models allow you to do. You'll start to see also that there's overlap between some of these models, and then that allows you to really even home in on the absolute key issues. So when you sort of cross-reference a lot of these theoretical models, the 4 or 5 I'm flagging here, and you find the points in common that they actually have, then you'll be left with probably 8 to 10 key issues. And you can really then be quite confident, I think, that those are especially important to study. Those are especially important to think about how might the examiner test these areas, and to kind of mentally work through what kinds of questions could come up. How might you respond to those? What are the theories you could draw on if those questions do come up? Porter's 5 Forces is another great model, thinking of the wider environment in which your company is operating. So supplier power, the threat of new entrants, the power of the customers that buy from your business, the threat of substitute products, and overall the competitive rivalry in the industry. So that again gives you a great high-level view of the kind of environment that your company is working in. Putting it all then into action, the importance of practice. And the graphic there in the background, I think, is important to reflect on, because it really shows what mock exam practice is about. You do not want your first or even your second attempt at sitting an exam for the case study to be the day of the exam, because you'll absolutely certainly, it will not be an optimal attempt. You want to make your mistakes on the practice court. So again, drawing on that sporting analogy, you want to miss your shots in your practice sessions. But when you step onto the pitch or the court, that's when you need to have fine-tuned your skill set so that you're able to hit the target. So those missed attempts there, you've got the dartboard. All of those missed attempts, they all happen in practice. Big deal, because on the day of the exam, you're hitting the bullseye. So if you go into the exam and it's your first attempt at sitting one of these exams, you're absolutely not going to have an optimal day. It's not going to be your best attempt. You might pass, but the odds are against you. you need to practice and you need to make your mistakes outside of the real exam. So practice, practice, practice. Lots of mock exams, as many as you can get your hands on. So many fail due to insufficient question practice. Often, in our experience, especially when we're correcting scripts, it's not so much that candidates are, that they have insufficient theoretical know-how. Often we'll get, with the first mock exam attempt, we'll see, this candidate has a lot of theoretical knowledge. It's just they don't know how to write the exam. They're taking the wrong approach. They're not managing their time well. They're not structuring their answers. They're not taking a common sense approach to managing their time. They're not using the information in the exam itself. They're not drawing on the pre-seen information. They're the kinds of errors that they make. But it's not a lack of knowledge. So time management is another crucial thing that until you actually sit a mock exam, you're not going to understand just how time pressured this exam is. And we recommend that candidates do mock exams, that they not just do lots of mock exams, but they do the mock exams under exam timing conditions. So spending 45 minutes on each section of the exam, giving yourself 3 hours to complete a complete mock exam. Secondly, highly recommended, get feedback. Have an experienced tutor mark at least one mock exam. Most of the problems that we flag come with the first attempt. Okay, so with the second, third, fourth, and sometimes fifth attempts that students make with us, you'll see that there is a big improvement between mock 1 and 2. And then the gains are kind of incremental between mocks 2, 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5. But it's the first mock attempt that is absolutely crucial to get feedback on. So it's very, very important that you do that. And avoid the temptation to question spot. I mentioned this before. Resist the urge to question spot and provide pre-prepared answers to questions. Again, this is something that examiners are always pointing to. They're always complaining, that so many candidates come in, they clearly have their favorite questions. They've prepared 3 or 4 of them, and they are determined to work these answers, pre-prepared answers in, no matter what. So they'll start trying to apply them to questions that are not related to their answer. They're just determined to get them in, and they fail, unsurprisingly. So there we go. So that's the plan again, the one we looked at the start. We've looked at the format of the exam, the background, understanding your role as a finance officer, using the pre-seen information sensibly, applying theory, tying it all up with a few key models from E1, and the importance of mock exam practice.